Hello, this is Aaron. Welcome back to the show. I'm here today with Mike Yarbrough. He is the author of the book that we're going to talk about today, Tending the Fire, Ignite Your Heart, and Live Life as a Man. I'll hold this up here so you can see it. There's a link to buy it in the show notes. It's a real book. You can see it. You can hold it in your hand. There's a link to buy it in the show notes if you want to look there. He also owns a company called Rustic and Main, which makes extremely cool wedding rings. A lot of them look like they're made out of reclaimed materials of some sort, but they're really cool designs. You check it out. It's rusticandmain.com. And then he also runs Wolf and Iron, which we'll talk about more during the show, but which you can visit in wolfandiron.com. So, Mike, thanks again for joining.
Yeah, Aaron, glad to be here, man. Excited to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, so you may notice I don't sound like my normal self, and that's because I've had a cold, and I've actually had very severe laryngitis the last few days. Yeah. So we'll see how my voice goes. But let's say the show must go on. So we're going to keep doing this. Once you schedule a live interview, you basically have no choice but to follow through with it. You know what I mean?
45 minutes into this, you're going to be like writing stuff on note cards, just showing it to the screen, like, answer this question, Mike.
I said if the word, the nice thing about live is we do have the comments feed, so I might have to type you through the comments if that happens. So you wrote the book, and then you also do a lot of writing and podcasting on men's issues at Wolf and Iron and other places. And how did you get attracted into this kind of, men's commentary business?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, like a lot of guys, I grew up without a permanent father figure. I had my grandfather in my life and a couple of guys that came along as I was growing up and kind of getting into my own stuff. But I also realized that I just didn't have a lot of direction as to like what it meant to be not just a man, but just the practical stuff, like a dad, a husband, diligent employee, or whatever the case was. And as I began to grow a little bit in these areas and had other guys come alongside me and kind of sometimes call me out, but a lot of times just kind of give me nudges in the right direction, I realized that there was a lot of guys who didn't have this as well, needed that. And so I got a passion for just helping guys just locally, men's groups and things like that. And then I also realized this was probably about 2012 or so, maybe a little bit earlier than that. I realized that there's a vacuum that's basically created because of the lack of dads and the lack of masculinity and things like that. And I thought there's going to be people who take advantage of this, like in a bad way. There are going to be people out there trying to convince men that, being a man looks like, all these really negative qualities, macho type stuff, and really just miss the heart of manhood. And so I thought, I really want to get into this space. I really want to do something. The name Wolf and Iron actually came about. I was listening to some friends. I just kind of overheard them talk. I think it was actually after something at church. I don't remember what it was exactly, but I remember being there. And I just walked past them, and I thought I heard them say Wolf and Iron, and I was like, man, that sounds manly. Like, that sounds awesome. Like, I want to use that. That's going to be my thing. What is that? And so I went and got the domain name and all this other kind of stuff. And then I looked it up, and it was this old book. They were talking about post-apocalyptic books they liked. And so I got the book, read it. It was pretty cool. It was a good little book. And anyhow, but it fit with the themes, just this idea of just going out into the world, becoming a man, just seeing what you're made of, being tested, being refined, having other guys kind of show you the ropes and all that kind of stuff. And so it just was a good fit. And it's just that name, Wolf and Iron, just, draws guys in just like it did me so many years ago.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you mentioned, there's a lot of guys out there who are saying things that aren't necessarily so good. And if you look at, the online men's space out there, you're a Christian. And that's one of the things that really attracted me to get you on the show. I'm a Christian, and I run a Christian men's newsletter called The Masculinist. And most of the guys out there are not Christians. Yeah. A lot of them are, some of them, as you say, are outright kind of promoters of evil, like the pickup artists. Or different people like that, but even like even with like good people like Art of Manliness, Brett McKay, Art of Manliness. I think he's a Mormon. Yeah, there just really aren't a lot of explicitly Christian people out. Why do you think that is?
I think part of it is, as Christians, we've taken too much time really looking at the negative qualities of humanity, and saying, well, all that stuff gets covered up by Christ and being a good Christian and being a soft-spoken, well-mannered, kind of put-together individual. It strips a lot of the masculinity away from what men actually desire, the kind of rough living, the kind of hard life. And it also prevents us from really having conversations about the real issues in life. And thankfully, a lot of churches are changing on this, and men's groups have come a really long way on this as well. But the truth is, a lot of Christians don't really know how to engage in the space of just raw masculinity or just talking about the fundamentals of what it means to be a man without doing it in this kind of whitewashed, kind of sugar-coated Christian speak sort of language that just doesn't appeal to guys. And so, like focus on the family stuff. They're doing really good things. No knock against those guys. But I don't go to focus on the family to find out how to be a man, even though they have episodes and they talk about, manhood and things of that nature. There's some aspects that are missing. And so when I began Wolf and Iron, I thought, well, I'm a Christian and I want to bring Christianity into this thing. But at the same time, I don't want to start every podcast episode or blog or whatever it is with like a chapter and verse. And I don't want it to be something that just appeals to Christians that are looking to become better men. I actually want to appeal to men that are looking to become better men, and then say, hey, look, one of the key elements here is kind of knowing where we all come from, what we're all about, being able to answer some of the bigger questions in life, that kind of stuff. And so those are all, answered through Christianity and from a Christian worldview. And so that's really where I come from. And I think, the natural tendency of most guys is just to say, what are the things that I'm drawn to? The guys that aren't Christians out there, the pickup artists and stuff like that. What are the things that I'm drawn to that might other guys be drawn to that also make me money? And it ends up being something that's not really great, The other piece to that is, there's always this sort of pendulum swing as well that takes place, where if we recognize as men that we're looking for guys who are strong, who are dependable, who are rugged, individualistic, and in a lot of things that we're missing out in the church, then we're going to swing that pendulum and we're going to start looking to guys that kind of carry that as their identity rather than Christ as their identity. And so we just, the pendulum is going to swing that way, and we're going to be drawn to those guys. And we need those guys. I mean, we need some of those guys in our circles. But a lot of times those things are just devoid of, Christ and Christianity, Christian principles, and those things. The guys like you said, the Art of Manliness, Brett McKay. He's a Christian, or he's a Mormon, and he talks about Christianity in sort of a generic sense sometimes. Like the good qualities of Christianity. He doesn't really go into his actual beliefs as a Mormon and how that influences him and stuff like that, which I've kind of noticed from a lot of the guys who are Mormons that I know. Just amazing guys, amazing families, guys I'd want to have in my corner. They don't really talk about what they believe. That was something else that I wanted to do differently, was actually get into the trenches a little bit and say, here's why I believe what I believe about Christ and Christianity. Here's, the things that I struggle with, or the things that are a mystery to me. Let's unpack these things together, but let's not be afraid to go there and talk about this stuff. And so I think that's something that separates what I'm doing from what some of these other guys are doing.
Yeah. One of the things that I find interesting about you, and I think is very important, is, you mentioned focus on the family. The people in focus on the family are essentially professional Christians. And
that's true. I never thought about it like
so
that.
if you think about it, like most of the Christian material on sort of like manhood or womanhood, any of the stuff, it's from sort of professional Christian. It's from a pastor. And, you're not, the professional Christian. You're an entrepreneur.
I'm an amateur Christian.
You're an entrepreneur. You're someone who's, you're a lay Christian.
Yeah.
And you're just engaging this field as, from a standpoint of, hey, I'm a Christian. It's sort of, now you do. I mean, I will say I was really amazed. Your book is like the first kind of book in this genre I've read that's not an explicitly Christian book that actually has a gospel presentation in it. You're like, here's the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's great.
Right.
But you're not everything that you're saying is like, a lot of it's just, it's not like a sermon. It's about how to be a man, but it's informed by the values that you have as a Christian. That I think that's good. And I've always been saying like Christians need to engage in the world, in their fields, from this sort of implicitly Christian perspective, because if we're just relying on the pastors to commentate on everything, they're not necessarily going to get it.
Well,
right?
You're absolutely right. And one of the challenges that we have right now is that if you're a lay Christian, it's almost like talking about psychology in a field where if you're not a doctor, people just go, well, you don't know what you're talking. You don't need to write a book on that. You don't have any valid opinions on that. But there are a lot of guys who have been through stuff, like been through their own trauma, and you could be riding in the truck with them. They'll tell you things about how life works and how your mind works and all this kind of stuff. I'd rather listen to those guys than somebody who's got a PhD. The same thing about lay Christians. There are guys out there just like me, just like you, that are, hey, look, I'm a Christian. I love Jesus. Here's the things that I know. Here's some things that I don't know. Let's share some ideas. But there's this tendency, maybe less with Christianity, but there's this tendency to say, well, if you're not a pastor or if you're not a, something like that, professional Christian, then you don't belong in this space. And so that's something that I really wanted to break up and just say, no, I don't know what space I belong in, but doggone it, I'm going to have that conversation and I'm going to bring these things to bear on the guys that I'm in league with. Back in the day when we asked the question of whether or not something was Christian, when I'm talking back in the day, like early 1900s and before, we really asked the question about the values that it upheld. So if we said, is this a Christian business or is this a Christian person? We would say, yeah, they follow Christ. They have these certain values. They're honorable. They care about other people. They exude those values. Nowadays, when we say, is it Christian? We're asking, well, is it getting published by a Christian publisher? Has it been whitewashed? Has it been approved by our pastors? Has it been, all these other kind of things? Does it have the certain kind of words we're supposed to say and not say in it? And that's totally different than where we need to be, especially if we're going to engage the world, wherever the world happens to be, where they stand. Showing up as a professional Christian, not as effective as just being a dude who's going through it.
I agree, and I think the other thing that comes with that is, a lot of this stuff, it's about life, and sometimes even the best advice goes horribly wrong. You can do everything right, and life can suck anyway.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times it's like when these pastors start talking about stuff that's sort of outside the wheelhouse of the Bible.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work, or something bad happens, it sort of can discredit the gospel a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I think if you or I say something, nobody expects me. I always tell people I'm not an authoritative Bible preacher, and and so yeah, I think it's very helpful.
C.S. Lewis had a really good approach to it. He would say things like, even in his books and the addresses that he gave over the radio, he'd say, look, I'm just a lay person and I don't know much, but here's what I think about it. Mm-hmm. And he would just kind of, that's almost a self disqualifier or whatever you want to say. It's almost like saying, hey, look, I'm about to say something, put a question mark over it. Maybe it makes sense. Maybe it doesn't. I'm open to debate on this. I'm not trying to be an authority on the subject, but this is what makes sense to me. And just putting it out there like that, I think covers a lot of that, where you don't have to worry about, like, if somebody, there was a movement probably 15 years ago. Who was the guy? The I Kiss Dating Goodbye guy.
Oh, yeah, Joshua Harris.
Yeah. And, he was like, look, this book was written for a specific audience and a specific purpose and a specific time. And it got taken to this whole thing of, like, you're never supposed to date. You shouldn't kiss anybody before you get married. this whole, like, extremes kind of case. And he was like, I didn't mean for any of that to happen. But at the same time, that's the thing that can happen. Whereas if it's me, you or I, and it's like, if we're writing a book, I'll put in there and say, look, I might be wrong about this, but here's what I think. Take it or leave it. Then it's kind of on somebody else if they decide to mishandle the information.
Yeah. No. You mentioned living with your grandparents. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a little town called Mercer, Tennessee. It's near Jackson, Tennessee, which was a small town, but there's some songs about it. Johnny Cash did a few songs. I think at least one where he's mentioned Jackson, and then which is about an hour or so from Memphis. But anyhow, the even smaller area that I grew up in was something called Hatchie. So inside of Mercer, Tennessee, which is a small podunk town, the Hatchie River runs through there, and so there's an area of Mercer which is called Hatchie, and so there's the river just went right by our house. A lot of times would flood into our yard, and we would hunt down into the bottoms and stuff like that. So yeah, I had a very much a country life kind of growing up in the 80s and in the early 90s, and the city was something that we went to. It wasn't something that I lived in all the time.
Yeah, I grew up 4 miles outside of a town of 29 people in rural southern Indiana, but we weren't. I think much like you say you're about an hour from Memphis. Yeah. It's not remote. In the sense that you could go to the city if you wanted to. It wouldn't be like getting on a plane or something to go to a city or a very, very long trip.
Yeah.
And you talk about, I think one of the great points you made in the book, you talked a little bit about the difference between country poverty and city poverty.
Yeah.
So you sort of grew up poor, I gather, out in the country.
Yeah, it kind of depends on how we think about it. Poor from the city standpoint, maybe not poor from a country standpoint. Both my grandparents worked, and there was a period of time where I went to a private school, and that kind of stuff. So we may not have been poor financially, I don't know, but if you just came into our house and you saw how we lived, you'd be like, wow, this is nothing like how people live in the city. So poor in that sense. And, I had hand-me-downs, and there was a lot of things we couldn't afford. But it didn't really bother us because it was like, that was just what you did. It made sense. Why would you buy new clothes if you could just get something from somebody else? Why would you go to the grocery store and buy your meat if you could just, hunt for a few months and store it up yourself? Why would you pay for vegetables if you could just get fresh stuff from your own garden, And that's still how my grandparents lived, by the way. They're still living, and they still probably work harder than I do in a day. They'll go out and pick a, ton of vegetables and have them canned by 10:30 in the morning, and I'm still groggy from my second coffee or something. But there's a big difference between growing up at a place where you have the ability and examples of what it looks like to be self-reliant versus growing up in the city where you're obviously poor compared to everybody else because you live in a trailer, and a trailer that you don't own. You don't have the ability to grow your own food or chop your own wood or, hunt or anything along those lines, at least not easily around there. You everywhere you go, an example to everybody else, you're less than. You have less shoes, lesser clothing, lesser, shows to watch on your TV. That's lesser already because it's not as good as everybody else's. It's just always you feel the poverty, and having those two experiences. And by the way, growing up in the country, there were people who were, when I say dirt poor, I'm talking dirt poor out there. And if you ask them if they were poor, if it bothered them, they get up, they go fishing every day. They got their own garden that they tend to. They have amazing cookouts, and all these neighbors come over. There wasn't this sense of poverty. It was really a sense of just, they had less things, but they were also less dependent on other stuff. And I think there's just we've done a real disservice to folks that are living in urban areas because, basically they're dependent upon handouts and, food stamps and those types of things. And I've been in that situation, and it's a very different feeling. You feel less than when you're dependent upon other people, when you don't have the ability to, through your own sweat and toil and dignity, go out and just kind of make your own stuff. Is very difficult to do in an urban setting. Whereas back in the day, the poor people primarily lived, out in the rural settings where they could, have their own food and land and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, when I was, young, I was under 10, let's just say, from a time when I was 4 to 10, and we were definitely, it was classic poor and didn't know it. And I think back about it now, I'm like, man, how did we live on that little money? But, one of the reasons it is, in that era, certainly in that time, which for me would have been the 70s probably, the late 1970s, and even into the early 80s, out in the country, nobody really lived that well. Even the people who, had really good jobs, which out there being a really good job would be have a job on the assembly line at Ford Motor Company in Louisville.
Sure.
If you worked at Ford, you probably drove a new pickup truck, and that was your thing. You drove a little better pickup truck, or you had a Mustang or something like that.
Yeah.
But everybody was shopping at the same stores, to the extent, eating at the same restaurants, in the town. You had to drive, 30 minutes to go to the Hardee's because we didn't have a McDonald's yet. But there was an egalitarian thing. There wasn't this stratification. Like in the city, you see rich people living like rich people. It's very obvious who has the money.
Sure.
There is a big social distinction, and so I think there is some kind of, I think you're right, there is sort of a degradation that comes from that doesn't happen in the country, hasn't happened in the country.
And it's different because, growing up, it was like, well, why don't you, and I'm thinking about this when I'm a kid, I'm like, why don't people in the city do more things for themselves? It's like, well, where are they going to do that? I mean, it's kind of odd now because we live in the suburbs of Charlotte. And if I need gravel for my fire pit, I have to go buy rocks, which is just a weird thing to me, having grown up in the country where you just had stuff. If I need firewood, well, I'm not going to chop down my own trees, so I got to either find trees that have been chopped, or I've got to buy firewood or something like that. It's a really weird scenario, and I found it actually really difficult to raise my own sons with the same kind of values and the same kind of ethics that I had growing up, because so much of the stuff is just, everything's a little bit, you have to pay for everything. Everything is a commodity of some kind in the city. Whereas in the country, you have some space, you have some, you have the ability to do for yourself. And there's this real sense of dignity that you get from just, I remember, when we'd go hunting, bring back the deer and process it and all that kind of stuff. This was a family affair. So we would actually all sit around the table, chopping up meat, putting it through the grinder, packaging it up and all that kind of stuff. And so from the field really to the freezer, we were all involved in this process. And the same thing was, taking stuff from the garden and all that. Well, inside of all that is just this dignity that you get of, I'm contributing to my family at a very, very early age. We're actually doing something that helps us, and then a couple of months later when it's, you've kind of forgotten about it, that meat comes out of the freezer. There it is, that deer that you killed, all those memories come back, all the experience of, what you did to get to this point. And you're like, man, this all these connections that take place. When you grow up in the city, that doesn't happen. Money comes from the government or, whatever the case is, working hard, you barely got enough to get by. Food comes from a can or from a box, and it's just not the same. And so people miss out on that. So they miss out on that dignity aspect. You do that for a couple of generations, and then you got people who don't even know how it feels to be independent and self-reliant.
Yeah, well, I ask about this because if you go back to like the late 19th, early 20th century, as society was urbanizing and industrializing, there was this real fear that kind of men were getting soft. And that's where the muscular Christianity movement started to develop right as society was urbanizing. Yeah. What role do you think kind of urbanization played in kind of dislocating our sense of manhood in the modern era? Or do you?
It really appealed to this idea that a man's primary role is to be a provider. So we kind of boiled that down to just like your role is to make money. And if you can go to the city and do that, then do that. Go to the city, take your family there, make money, work a 14-hour shift or whatever you got to in the factories back in the day, push buttons, do the same thing repetitively, and then you've provided for your family. And what we saw, and this is very appealing even to guys today, is go get a nice desk job that pays $120,000 a year, and you can sit in a cube and put money into your 401k, and we're still having these same kind of issues. A guy's role is to be a provider, and that's the way he does that primarily is through money. Well, the issue with that is you move away from the family, and so you strip men of their role as actually being fathers, being integrated into their communities. Now our maximum amount of effort during the day is really given to somebody else's dream and vision, which is fine to do that because there's a fair exchange of wages and all that kind of stuff. But it takes us removes us more out of the family, and it also puts us in a place where we're no longer in the field. We're not hunting. We're not scavenging. We're not planning, dreaming, designing, building, any of that kind of stuff. We're basically just, a worker, a factory person. And we miss out on the opportunity, once again, to experience what it actually feels like to be a true provider, ground up provider. I'm going to, back in the old day, I'm going to take my family across country, in a wagon, and we're going to chop down trees, and we're going to, everything's going to be from the ground up. And, we miss that. And there's a, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Everybody's probably familiar with that kind of that pyramid. At the bottom there, you've got, the basic needs that you have, food, shelter, and then eventually kind of move up into community and family and those kinds of things. And eventually you get to like a self-actualization piece. When we get further and further from actually participating in those early stages of self-development, we're missing out on things that we don't really know we're missing out of because they exist. Like our homes exist, our jobs exist, things are easy, entertainment exists. And we just sort of show up into a world where these things are, and we're less participatory. I don't know how to say that. We participate less in them than we used to. And so then we find ourselves in our 30s and 40s going, man, I just feel unfulfilled. Like I don't even know where I belong or what I'm doing. All these things kind of spiral onto each other. And so when we talk about urbanization, so I'm less involved in the building of my home or the maintaining of my home or my yard, easy jobs where you just go and click a button and make decisions all day. Those kinds of things, they just strip us of the native, the instinctual cravings that we have as men. And it's not until later in life we realize that we've been on the wrong track for quite a while.
Yeah, the modern world is very abstract.
Yeah.
It's like there's layers and layers between us and the thing at the end of it.
Yeah.
I was actually running when I worked for a large IT infrastructure outsourcing company. I was running, like $20, $30 million in annual projects. And, people would like upgrade software on a router for security patches or something like that. Yeah. And even though I was in charge of this project, I couldn't tell you who was pressing the button to actually deploy that software. It's like I'm working with a layer who's working with the layer. There are 3 or 4 layers between me and the people that are actually pressing the buttons and doing the work.
Right.
And I kind of had like an idea. They're in this delivery center, one of these delivery centers here, or here. And it's just like, who's actually doing? I never met them. I never knew their names. I never was like kind of crazy. You're running something that you don't even know who's actually doing the work. It's very wild.
It is. And I see we've got some comments here from either FOF or F off. I don't know.
FOF,
I don't know if we wanted to hit those.
Yeah. He's got a question. Do you think it's healthier for human flourishing to live in a city, rural, or the suburbs?
So here's something that's interesting that's happening, and it's actually a good thing that's coming out of this whole COVID deal. People are being forced to work remote, and businesses are realizing that they can still do things with people working remotely. People then are realizing, well, if I can work from my home here in the suburbs of, say, Charlotte or New York or wherever they happen to be, well, what's to prevent me from working in this smaller town over here where things are a little bit slower paced? I get a little bit small town America kind of feel, or maybe even work in rural if I have, the Wi-Fi and, internet and all that kind of stuff availability. If I can do that from there, then maybe I don't have to be in the suburbs or in the urban, right in the city. I think it's giving people a lot more choices. I think there's probably going to be, my guess is that there will be stages of life that where people kind of like, maybe they start in the city and they slowly kind of move more rural. This is typically how it goes for us guys, by the way. If we have the option, we start closer to the city because it's convenient and where there's more people and families and those kinds of things. And then by the time we get into like our 50s or 60s, we just are crotchety and we don't want to be around anybody. And so we want to be like just farm, like lots of land. And so, that's kind of, those stages are going to be more possible. We're kind of still early on in this because obviously we're not really made for modern cities, like as far as human beings. That doesn't seem to work for us. Suburbs kind of work. Rural seems to be best in terms of like what we're used to and what really fulfills us long term. That's usually where most people settle, is this idea of I want to be on some land, seeing amazing sights, and just being able to see stars at night and that kind of stuff. And some of the things we already talked about. But as far as like what's absolutely best, and it's hard to say, but I am glad that we're able to have more opportunity to move from where like all the big jobs are in the city. Well, now it's that the jobs are just the jobs, and sometimes you can live just about wherever you want. And I think that's going to be really telling as to where people naturally settle given the opportunities.
Yeah, he also followed up with that by saying, I am moving my family outside of a town of about 25,000 in the country, remodeling it ourselves. Very rewarding.
Yeah, 100%. It's a lot of work, but it's, big time rewarding.
Yeah, I want to talk about the book. Again, it's called Tending the Fire, and there's a link to buy it in the show notes on either the YouTube or the podcast. And where did the name Tending the Fire come from?
Counseling session, actually. My wife and I were in counseling, which we've been in for many, many years. I highly recommend counseling, at least seasonally, in your marriage and, for your family and stuff like that. It's always great to get different perspectives. We were in a counseling session, and somehow the counselor and I started kind of talking back and forth about this notion, this idea that there's this fire in front of us, and just visualizing things. And there's this cave, and and from the cave comes these logs, and these logs are just larger, and they represented something. I can't remember exactly what it was in the counseling session. Well, I kind of tuned out, and in my brain I'm going, oh, that's perfect for this book that I want to write. It's a great analogy. And so I don't remember really the whole concept of what we were talking about, exactly where it came from. But it came from this counseling session, and the more I kind of thought about it, slept on it, had it kind of spin around in my mind, I thought, man, that's so deep. That's just hitting me. It's just resonating with me. Just this idea that every man has a fire inside of to be tended. This cave sort of represents, the fire kind of represents our spirit and our vim and vigor and our life force and all these other kind of things. But it also, the cave sort of represents the sort of dark, unknown areas of both ourselves, unanswered questions that we have about life. It represents the fears that, we need to tackle and illuminate and drive out. So many different areas and ways to kind of go with that. And it just stuck with me. And I thought, man, that's just awesome. I want to use that as the theme of my book. And so we open up on that and just carry that theme, throughout. And it was funny. I was talking to Stephen Mansfield. I got his book here, Men on Fire. Give him a little plug. Beep. He was at a conference, men's conference, I guess about 2 years ago now or so. And I said, Stephen, what book are you working on, next? He said, I'm working on a book called Men on Fire. And I was like, oh man. I was like, I've got a book that I'm working on. I've been working on it for 6 years called Tending the Fire. It's probably going to come out not long after yours drops. I was like, just want to let you know I'm not ripping you off. And, but the thing is that analogy of fire and men and passion, that just comes up so often, even in the ancients when they're talking about manhood and stuff like that. There's just a sense of fire. It's a very primitive thing. Caves, very primitive, but I think it connects to something that we need to be about.
I think about 2 Timothy, where Paul tells Timothy to stir up once again the flame. Isn't that one of his analogies there? I mean, I thought this was an interesting book. You kind of organize it. I'm not sure the right word. It's either kind of little like meditations or aphorisms or kind of vignettes organized by theme. Kind of each chapter's got a theme, and you kind of share little kind of thoughts on it. So it works that like, you could just get little different things. It's almost, you could treat it as a devotional if you wanted to. I'm not saying you would do that, but it's got that kind of like, kind of digestibility to it. And this is like asking somebody what is jazz, but from your perspective, like what is manhood?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a question that I get quite a bit. And, I always say if we had a really good one sentence answer for it, then, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. You wouldn't be doing what you're doing. And this would be a pretty, we just have it on a t-shirt and just make a bunch of shirts and send them out. When we talk about manhood, one of the things that we have to recognize is that there are certain principles, there are certain virtues that men are drawn to, but they're the same principles in terms of the words that women are drawn to. So like in the book, we talk about living courageously, living deliberately, truthfully, spiritually, virtuously, and so on. Well, women are courageous. Women are deliberate. They can be, truthful just like men. So when we talk about being a man, what is it that separates men and really makes that unique, something that is different than, masculinity, different than femininity? And I think that it's something that we instinctively know and we feel and experience. It's the way that something is lived out versus just something that's defined. The difference between, how an acoustic guitar sounds versus an electric. You can just tell. It's the same note. It could even be almost the same types of strings, but, they're going to sound different. We recognize masculinity. There are certain things that men are really designed to do. Like we've got to get it into our brain. Like I'm made for this. One of those is to be a provider. So we want to provide for our families financially. We want to provide for their safety and security. We want to provide for their spiritual well-being and those kinds of things. So we want to show up and we want to have something that really drives us. We want to, we want to have a goal and a purpose and a mission. We don't want to just drift through life listless. Women tend to be more nurturing. Like that seems to be their driver. And sometimes that nurturing can look a lot like how we provide, but they're going to have a different spin on it. And what we found, through biology and science is that when men show up and we're able to provide, our testosterone goes up and we feel more like men when we have a mission and a purpose. When women show up and they nurture, they feel more like women and their estrogen and other, female hormones go up. And, there's some of that kind of stuff where when we're talking about manhood, what that means, it's not something that's easy to nail down. I wish it was. And this is where, we want to say, well, men love bacon and beer and boobs and they, they're tough and they're strong. Like you can name all the stuff that guys like generally. That doesn't really define manhood. I think it's just an ongoing thing that has to get lived out. You know it when you see it. You know it when it's missing. And I think we've got to do a better job of just showing examples of it. I always wish I had a great one-liner for this, but I always just feel like I'm just doing a disservice when I try to sum it up.
Yeah, the beer, bacon, and boobs, I think, is what society kind of wants to tell you that it's acceptable. Like, that's the acceptable face of manhood in society is kind of that kind of lowbrow, bro-ish thing. And it was an article somebody wrote not long ago, sort of, I don't know if you saw the whole I don't know what you think of Black Rifle Coffee, but there was just a big kerfuffle around Black Rifle Coffee and their article in the New York Times. Somebody wrote criticizing them, basically saying, look, Black Rifle Coffee is saying it's this kind of parody of a man who's shooting guns, machine guns, and blow torches and all this stuff, but it gets away from like the real. So I do think that idea that the three B's, bacon, beer and boobs, is like that is unfortunately what a guys are about today, which is not good.
It is. And as far as Black Rifle goes, some of their commercials, they go a little bit too far for me as far as like, what they're, kind of how they do that kind of stuff. They know what they're doing. Like they're aware, like we're being a parody and we're just having fun.
Yeah.
Here, we're kind of taking that extreme of like what guys like and all that kind of stuff. We get that. What I don't like is when you're watching something, it's a commercial or it's a TV show, and they're really not trying to be a parody. They're not trying to be an extreme. They're just saying like, this is how guys are. And other guys go, oh yeah, I guess that's how I'm supposed to act. I'm a kind of a one-dimensional guy. And if I care about things like, philosophy or art or anything that just sort of expands my mind as a man, well, I must be effeminate or gay or, whatever the case is. If I don't feel hyper masculine, then I don't really fit into the masculine circles. That's obviously not true. Some of the greatest leaders, really all the greatest leaders, have always been men of just amazing character differentiations. George Washington, for example, loved plays. He would have his guys actually get together and do plays. And, which is kind of weird if you think about George Washington. You just think about him riding on a horse into battle and, and all that kind of stuff. But no, he liked plays, and he loved to talk about, theater and those kinds of things. And, that's what we need to get back to. We're multidimensional. We need guys that have a lot, that are well-rounded, more than just like, our bellies.
I agree. That's the only well-roundedness some of us have, alas. So you list 5 key kind of, I don't know if they're principles of manhood or whatever, but they're really kind of 3 things, living deliberately, living courageously, living virtuously, living truthfully, and living spiritually. And I kind of just wanted to go through those because I think they're all great headings of different things. What does it mean to live deliberately?
So I think that, whether we say living deliberately or living intentionally, we're kind of talking about the same thing. I'll tell you that I believe that intentional living is going to separate the men from the masses in the next 10 to 15 years. It's happening right now, but we're going to be able to look back on it and say the guys that were intentional about how they approached life, when they, get to the end of their life, so, 30, 50 years, however long that happens to be from now, they're going to have a very different story to tell from the guys who allowed themselves to just go through life just in the motions of it all. There's so many opportunities to be distracted today. There's so many opportunities to just live life in kind of a listless wandering, without really care, just kind of seeing what comes up next, expecting life to just sort of happen to you. That's not living deliberately. And what a lot of guys that I talk to, almost at the top of the list of when I ask guys what their problems are, what they're dealing with today, it's loneliness, missionless, purposelessness, anxiety, depression, those kinds of things are popping up. In a world where we have as many distractions as you could think of, guys are feeling like they don't know what they're about, what they're supposed to be doing when they wake up in the morning, what's supposed to excite them and get them going. And, living deliberately, living with intention every day has a lot to do with that. So one of the things that I don't mention it in this book, but we do it with my guys' groups and different things, is having a word of the year. And maybe your first word of the year could be intentional, but having a word of the year. So you say, this is what I want to improve in. At the end of this year, this is what I want to be better in. That's a great way to, and you can start that now. You can start it, ideally January 1st, but just pick out a word and say, this is an area that I want to grow in. That starts your intentionality. And then, have a vision, get a dream about where you want to be at the end of your life, 10 years, 15 years from now, and what kind of things are really going to excite you and make you feel proud to have been on this earth.
Yeah. I think a lot of times guys talk about mission, and so you've got 2 businesses that you own, your podcast, your writing books, so I've got my news, and I got a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are like, yes, we know kind of like the heroic Silicon Valley entrepreneur is having an intentionality and a mission, but how does like the average person in America, how does like somebody says, I'm just a regular guy, I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm not a super genius, I'm not the strongest or most athletic guy. How do I find a sense of purpose and intentionality if you're just like an average, self-perceived average guy?
Yeah. So, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. We always think about the extremes, like the guy who pushes the most weight, who lost the most weight, who has the biggest business, most followers. That's just kind of the land that we live in. But look, if there are a lot of guys who are cut out to be the best father they can be, which is better than the father that they grew up with, to be a servant locally and those kinds of things. Don't see that as like a lesser thing. It's really about finding what works for you. So here's what I say. Here's the process that I take guys through. You want to think about, what is your worldview? So what are the things that in your worldview, say you're Christian, really matters to you? What really speaks to your heart? Well, all right, I believe in God, and I believe that we should do good to each other, and we should be kind to, family, our family and friends, and, serve the community and give back and those kinds of things. Okay, so now we're talking about things that are at the core of what drives you and makes life matter to you. Then you need to talk about, well, what are the things that I'm passionate about in that kind of vicinity? Well, maybe I like taking pictures. Maybe I like doing art. Maybe I like mowing the grass. Maybe I like whatever it is. I don't know what it is. It's different for every guy. What are your passions? And then you say, well, what are the things that I'm talented in? Sometimes your passions and your talents line up. Sometimes they don't, but a lot of times your passions will fuel your talents. And so you just kind of go through this sort of exercise of thinking, well, what do I believe? What am I passionate about? What am I talented in? Man, and there are guys who say, my contribution to the world is going to be, I'm going to teach guys how to fly fish. And I'm just going to have an open weekend a couple times a month, and I'm just going to have a couple guys come out and we're going to fly fish. I mean, how cool is that? Take entrepreneurship, take all the other stuff, and just take dudes out hunting and fly fishing. If that's your thing, do that. But it's just this conversation, just asking those questions. That's intentionality, and that makes guys go, man, what really would make me, feel like I have a purpose and a mission, and I'm connecting. What has connected me before with other people? Asking those questions, and then just coming up with a list, and then just get practical about it. What can I do? There's all kinds of things. There are guys that they fly drones. That's their thing. They just like to fly drones in cool places and hang out with people and drink beer or something. That's fine. Do that cool thing and just be, have that as part of your mission of just you connecting with people.
Yeah, I think today's world, the degree of difficulty dial has been turned up, in some respects, and in some important ones. And the example I always like to use on intentionality or, living deliberately is about getting married. Mm-hmm. For my grandparents' generation, it was just natural. You were going to come together and you're going to get married. Now, not everybody got married, but almost everybody did.
Yep.
And most of them stayed together their whole lives. Well, now, if you want to be married, much less stay married, let's say about getting married, you actually have to be as intentional about what you do to get married as you are about the college you want to get into. And I see so many guys, they're always strategizing about, here's how I'm going to get into the right college, or here's how I'm going to get this thing that I want. But when it comes to relationships, we sort of just say, it would be artificial. We shouldn't try too hard. It's just let it be organic. It'll naturally happen.
Yeah. A
lot of things don't naturally happen, And so I think we have to have intentionality around preparing ourselves, about seeking out a mate, about a lot of things, and about, that's just to get there. So much less stay there. It's a challenging environment that does require a lot of intentionality today.
There are not a lot of opportunity. Well, let's say this. There probably are opportunities, but there aren't the natural. There's not the natural environment where commitment to things is just part of life. You don't have to commit to a show. You don't have to commit to a job. You don't even have to commit to a church. You don't have to commit to anything really these days. You just it's all about you, and you just go through life. And so we've lost that. I talk to guys all the time. I got married when I was 18, and I talk to guys all the time who are, in the 20s and 30s, and I go, what's the scene like today? What's it like to date? And they're just like, Mike, it's a mess. There was college, and maybe there were some opportunities there, and that was about it. And everything else after that is just like, you're either online trying to meet people in some kind of weird virtual space, or, it's just odd. And, once again, our society is not really set up to do the things that we need to do as humans to actually procreate, and just the biological drive to just get together and start a family and all that kind of stuff. It is hard. But once again, intentionality is there. And so for the guy who's saying, I know I want to be married, I know I want to have a family, well, where am I going to find this lady? What does that process look like? Once again, it's like you said, it's almost like going to college. You got to be intentional about it. It's not going to just happen. And most of the good things in life don't just happen. That's a lie. And we need to get past that. We need to realize that if you want something good in life, you got to go after it. Enough said about that.
Well, living courageously, I think everybody kind of has like an idea of courage. But what does living courageously look like in today's world? For a guy like Socrates, it meant going into battle for Athens. But what does that mean? What does it mean for the average person today in the modern world?
It may be, signing up for the military or something like that. I think that today there's ample opportunity to be courageous just by going against the common narrative and speaking your mind. We talked about this a little bit before when we had our conversation just one-on-one. But, there's a lot of guys from New York coming down here to Charlotte. And I love those guys because they just, not all of them, but, they're the typical New Yorker. He's just, or the guy from New Jersey, wherever, just northerner. They like to speak their mind. They just say what's on their mind. Here's what I'm thinking. And I'm like, yes, somebody's doing that. That's courage to me. And it may just be normal to them, but that's courage, especially being down here in the South where everybody's all nice. Mm-hmm. I think there's plenty of opportunity to stand up for what you freaking believe and what you think is right. And I think it takes courage to do that in a respectful way. You don't have to just blast people on social media or whatever the case is, but just taking a stand and saying, here's why I believe what I believe. There's something in the book that I talk about called first courage. And it's this initial courage to say, I'm willing to be that guy. I'm willing to be the guy that takes a stand when everybody else doesn't, and might look like I'm standing alone, might look like I'm a fool for saying what I'm saying, but I'm willing to be that guy. That's first courage. And that's that initial kind of impulse to just like, we know that it exists within us when somebody, like we're in a work meeting or social media, whatever the case is, but someone else speaks up and we say, man, that was exactly what I was thinking. Man, that's exactly what I wanted to say. I'm so glad you stood up and said that. What that means is that you have that initial impulse, but you denied yourself the opportunity to actually exercise courage. So that's that first courage we've got to get. I'm willing to be that guy. I'm willing to be the guy who's wrong. I'm willing to be the guy who makes a fool of himself because I'm speaking my mind and standing up for what I believe in. And like I said, there's tons of opportunity, to do that these days.
Yeah, it is. I do think there's a lack of courage out there that I really see. I'll tell a story. Maybe I shouldn't tell this story, but
those are the best stories.
It's not like a personal one to me, but there's one of these kerfuffles we see every day now, where the head of the local library here in Indianapolis is being accused of racism and running the library system like a plantation, and
wow.
which is not true. I mean, all these people in the community, and here's the thing, all these people in the community, they know her personally, they know her character, they can attest to who she is, all the things that she's done, the way that she's lived her life, and yet not one of them has said a peep publicly in defense of her. And I see this all the time.
Yeah.
Whenever somebody gets attacked on one of these things by, let's just say it's just a totally, people say outrageous things about it, or just crazy over the top things.
Yeah.
And even like their personal friends who know them will not defend them in public. Yeah. It's like, wow. And you see this every time. It's like, and I kind of like, but say the lesson to take away is like, if you're in any sort of leadership position today in this world, if you get attacked by the mob, everybody's going to abandon you.
Yeah.
And it's like, you see how these people, they act like, oh yes, I would have stood up for Galileo or something. I'm like, no, I see, it's easy to see why nobody stood up for those people, because we're seeing it today.
Yeah, sure.
When it actually requires courage,
it does.
To cross the kind of called elite consensus, that's when there is no courage. Yeah, and we're not exactly in a courageous age here.
We're not, and it's strange because we should be. Like the internet, there's so many things that equalizes people.
Right.
And that's it's strange my mindset is I just don't understand why people aren't more, courageous and vocal about the things that they believe in. But, it is. And so, but once again, you want to stand out these days. You want to be a man who your kids can look back and go, my dad, my grandpa, whatever was awesome. This is how you do it. You actually stand up and say the things that other people won't say. And to me, that sounds fairly easy because I've been doing that my whole life. But I think that's how you do it. Same with intentionality, right. Same with the other things.
Yeah. I'm going to skip the order in your book because okay. I think it's related. I think it's very related to this idea of living truthfully.
Yeah.
And having the courage to live within the truth.
Yeah.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, made that famous essay, Live Not by Lies, the Soviet dissident, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago. And you see a lot of the communists, or I think it's Václav Havel's idea of, living within the truth, finding a way, even in this repressive authoritarian system, to live within the truth. And I think it's interesting that the Soviet dissidents put such a premium on being willing to live your life in alignment with truth, no matter what the thing said. And that goes right along with courage. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to there's like knowing the truth and then there's living the truth.
Sure.
It's very, very different things. But where were you going with living truthfully? To me, that's one of the most important things.
It's 100%. If anybody asks me what's the number one virtue that a guy has to have, it's integrity. Mm-hmm. He's got to have integrity with himself, but even goes beyond that because it's the sense that I actually love the truth. Like even if it doesn't agree with me, even if what I want the world to be, I want to live in the truth. I love the truth. I want things to be true. We all know this is how we ought to think. I mean, like nobody wants to open up their bank account one day and see it's all zeros when we had $5,000 in the bank the day before, and we call the bank and say, "Well, hey, what happened to my money?" And the bank says, "Well, our truth is that you don't have any, but your truth is that you have $5,000. So good luck with that." We don't want to do that. We all know we believe in truth because we believe in justice. We can't have justice without truth. Nobody wants to be accused of a crime they didn't commit and thrown in prison. So we all know truth is like fundamental to how we operate. We can't work without it. And in the book, I talk about some of those things, but I also talk about just this idea that we have to love truth. It's ultimately you can't escape the fact that if you're traveling down a bad road, it's a bad road, and it's going to lead to bad things. Well, if you don't love truth, you're never going to try and course correct because it doesn't matter to you. You're just going with feelings, going with what seems correct. And and one of the things that I can't stand these days is people talking about my truth. I have my truth and you have your truth, and we can have different. No, that's called an opinion. Like everybody has an opinion. That's not the same as truth. Truth is something that's immutable. It doesn't change based upon, it's objective. It's something that doesn't change based upon how you perceive things or how I perceive things or whatever. And we have to have a love for that. The guys that were writing, in the old Soviet days, they were up against this idea that just the Soviets are never wrong. The pride that was so strong, and they just saw all the terrible things that came from that. And if they didn't live by truth, there was just this soul crushing aspect of how you ended up in life, and they didn't want to be that way. And that's the same for us as men. We've got to learn to just really love truth, even if it's uncomfortable. One of the things that I talk sometimes about, I don't try to harp on it because it's one of those subjects that's like, I don't want to become known for like the guy who talks about this, but we'll talk sometimes on the podcast is about transgenderism. Well, okay, there's going to be a day when we've got such a mastery of biology and a mastery of science and medicine that you can take a pill or walk into a machine or something like that, and you can come out all kinds of things. You'll have a tail, you'll have some extra fur, you could be taller, you could be shorter, you could be a man, you could be a woman. We're not there yet, all right? I'm a big fan of sci-fi, so I think one day these things will be cool for us to kind of do, and we'll see what happens. But we're not there yet. And the truth is, and this is the part of having that honest discussion, someone who really wants to go from one gender to the next, they can't truly do it. Like we just can't make that happen. That's not me being anti people wanting to experiment with, do whatever they want to with their life. I'm a big freedom guy. But I also think we ought to be able to say, you're going to get stuck at a certain place along this road that you can't move past. And you're going to, that's going to be really hard on you. What do you do about that? Part of that is loving truth, be able to have honest discussions with people that say, you know what, that is true, So I probably should take that into consideration, not just keep going down the same road that's going to end up, very bad for them. But there are all kinds of areas in life where if we don't exercise truth, it's going to end up very, very bad for us. We've got to learn to really love it. We've got to learn to say, no matter what, I want to know what is true. I want to be after that. And, if it's a lie, I don't want to have anything to do with it.
I think it was Theodore Dalrymple who said that the purpose of kind of communist propaganda was to humiliate, which is this idea that they make these outlandish statements that you are essentially forced to repeat and assent to and agree with. And there is something that sort of debases or corrupts your soul when you start repeating these lies. And it essentially saps your will to resist morally.
Yeah.
And they had that sort of, and again, I think there is really something about the idea that the Soviet dissidents put so much premium on truth. And, I think we see it in the Bible too. It's like Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Pilate says, what is truth? So it's
Jesus
like,
is like,
those,
I'm here, dude. You're looking at it.
That's the kind of the two different ways that, to think about it. I know we're coming up. We're like 5 minutes at the top of the hour. Do you have like a stop time here? I want to be.
No, I'm good.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
we won't go too terribly long, but I did want to get through these 5 elements because you had like good things to say on all of them.
Yeah, we're good.
And living virtuously.
Yeah.
What is that one?
So we don't really talk about virtues these days. We don't talk in the language that we ought to. So our kids kind of grow up without this language, this idea of like even feelings language. You're angry, you're happy. There's probably some other terms for those things. That's about it. We don't really talk about virtues. So I don't know if I talk about this in the book. There were some things that I wrote in the book originally that got cut where I was just like, it's just kind of going off into a tangent here. But one of the things that I like to talk about in interviews like this is developing a language of virtues where, when your kid does well at the baseball game or the soccer game, whatever it is, instead of saying, you did a good job today. Hey, you're really strong out there. Those are all fine things to say, but think about what are the virtues that they exhibited that gives them a language to think like they, you really showed initiative today. You really, there's a lot of fortitude out there in your playing. You've been really determined to not give up. There's a resilience or whatever the case is. There are all these words that we've almost lost because, we just don't use them anymore that really help us define like, oh, there's this intricacy to humanity and to being a good person. And so, we really need to think about living virtuously. It's this honorable kind of life. One of the things, I can't remember which chapter it's in that I talk about, is there's this, the sense where like, someone could be courageous. Like a Nazi soldier could be courageous when they jump from the trenches to go after, the Allied troops. The kamikaze pilot is courageous when they, dove into the ships at Pearl Harbor. But they're not good, like in that sense, like the ultimate, part of their mission was not good. So we've got to learn to think in terms of virtues and think about living life as a man is not just being helpful and useful and a provider, but it's also being good. And so it's interesting if you look at the Latin, the word virtus, where we get the word virtues, means life, means manhood, it means, all these good things. So, when we talk about being a man and we talk about being virtues, they're really interconnected. Man is supposed to be the epitome of virtuous living. And so one of the first ways that we address this is really just getting our vocabulary better about, what the virtues are and how to live that out as a man.
Yeah, I agree, and it's just something we don't see a lot of today either, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it gets to truth, like integrity. People don't, sadly, not too much of it.
We don't even hear the word.
Right.
We hear a lot of negative things. People are liars, people are cheats, people steal, but we don't really hear good words describing people these days in almost any platform. And so we have to be really intentional about that.
One sociologist who used to study the upper class, he talked about the way that the upper class used to enforce these norms of behavior, and like, like a gentleman would never cheat at cards, would never cheat at sports and things like that. And he talked about how, when the old establishment went away, he made some statement along the lines of, today in America, it's far better to be known as a consummate liar or an adulterer than it is to be known as politically incorrect. And it goes to show you that there is some weirdness there as well. And sorry, my voice is getting a little rough here.
You're good. You're good.
I do want to talk about this idea of living spiritually, which is I think a very unique part of the book. And again, what I thought was the most unique part is, there's people who've written kind of books about how to be a man and stuff like that.
Sure.
And you basically just say, there's a spiritual dimension to that, and you straightforwardly say, I'm convinced that like the gospel of Jesus Christ is true, and you put a gospel presentation in there.
Yeah.
Well, one, I'm interested in kind of your take on the spiritual notion, and then kind of what reaction you've gotten to that from people.
Yeah, so I was really worried. So one of the things is I don't want to say I take a dig, but I talk about church, modern church, in very real terms, and modern pastors, and kind of some of my experiences in very just sort of real terms. I just get real about it. So I thought maybe I'd get some heat from that. I don't think that's landed in the right laps or the wrong laps yet. For people to reach out and say, "Oh, I don't like this," or maybe I did a good job describing it, and I'm not going to get any flack for it. We'll see. But when it comes to just spirituality, I wanted to make sure, because I was using that term, living spiritually, I wanted people to have a real clear understanding up front. I'm not just talking about frou-frou yoga kind of spirituality, you're the universe and you're your own God and all that kind of stuff. I was talking about Christ-centered, Christian spirituality. And so part of the intentionality behind that chapter was just to drive that point home initially. It's like, look, I don't want you to get confused. This is not some book that's just for guys who think that in some sort of mysterious way being a spiritual person is good. No, I'm trying to tell you that if you care about truth and you care about courage and you're trying to live deliberately and you're trying to get a mission for your life and you're trying to better yourself, at some point you're going to ask the question, well, has anybody ever embodied these things? Has anybody ever shown like what that means or what that looks like? Is there any proof to this idea that I should have a purpose and I should have a mission? Those questions are going to come up if you're really concerning yourself with these things. And at some point, you're going to start investigating Christ. You're going to start investigating Christianity. And if you remove your ego, if you remove your experiences of Christianity out of the way, and you just say, I just want to know if this is real. I just want to know if this is true, regardless of how people have misused it or abused it, I think you're going to be led, once again, as I talk about in the book, is you're going to be led to the cross. You're going to be led to Christ. You're going to be led to his life. And you're going to see something there that you've never seen anywhere else. And so I just basically say, look, this is where you're going to eventually get. Maybe you're not there now. You're eventually going to get here. And if you do, these things that I'm about to talk about are really going to matter to you. And so I talk about us being spiritual creatures and how that shapes and informs the way we interact with each other and those kinds of things.
No, that's great. And I hope it makes an impact on people to read that. And that's kind of what I mean by, we have to be engaging on sort of this field. Not necessarily, it's not a religious book,
right?
So a non-Christian could pick it up and read it and find it of interest, but you're making sure that the things that you're saying, are pointing in that direction. And I think it was great that you added that call in there, because it's very authentic to who you are and to what is true.
Yeah, and it is, and one of the things that I think is maybe it's natural for them, but for some of the manly, sites out there that we can all appreciate and glean some information from and respect. One of the things that they don't do is they don't just directly answer the questions. Why am I here? How did we get here? What is life really about? Why should any of this matter? These are fundamental things that, like, as kids, we asked questions and we didn't get answers, and we're still going through life going like, I don't know why any of this matters. You can fall into nihilism pretty easily. I think we've got to be direct about these things. Like, I'm a man, this is what I believe, here's how I got to this, conclusion, take it or leave it. And just put it all out there for guys to digest. And, people are still going to make their own minds up about it. I'm not worried about leading guys astray or whatever. And some guys might say, Mike, I love everything about Wolf and Iron. I agree with everything in the book. I can't get on board with the Christianity thing. That doesn't make sense to me. Fine. You got something from here. Good. That's great. Let's talk about the things that you do get. But at the same time, there are guys out there that are looking for another man to say, it's God, it's Jesus, it's Christianity. This is key. Don't miss this, and to do it as a real guy, not just as a professional, pastor who's kind of essentially getting paid to do these things.
No, well, that's great. The other thing you mentioned in there is, that a lot of times the church doesn't appeal to men. And I think the stat you hear is that 60% of the people that go to church are women. And it probably varies by church denomination.
Sure.
What message would you send to the church? I have a lot of pastors that listen to my stuff, read my stuff. What message would you send to a pastor, to a church, about men and how to minister to men, and or maybe what you think could be improved?
Men don't want a ministry. I mean, that's nice that we have men's ministries. We're not like women in that way, where we want to once a quarter kind of get together or gathering or something like that. We want to be on mission together. We want our lives to be, kind of bound together and shielded together with one another. You got to cultivate that. You got to work hard to cultivate that. It's got to be the life of your church. The mission of the church in a lot of ways has to be about how do we make men do life together and make it really matter? How do we get into the real deal, with whatever men are struggling with? How do we make it to where, when a guy shows up and his marriage is in trouble, he can say, guys, my marriage is absolute trash right now. And he can get as real about it and he can say whatever he wants without feeling like he's being less of a Christian. Those kinds of things. I think there's a lot of, one of the challenges that we have, I talk a little bit about this in the book, is that the pastors don't really represent a lot of the kinds of men we long to be. There's a place for the typical kind of pastor where he's well-mannered and he's got a nice family and, he's got his life together and all that kind of stuff. We need that. But honestly, we're seeing a lot of guys who are, kind of soft, seem to have their life together, throughout our days. What we really want is that kind of rough and tumble sort of Jesus characters. We want the fisherman. We want the guy who hasn't forsaken wrench turning for page turning. We want the guy who's just like, hey, I just do life, with them, and they understand our kind of, how things are made up. A lot of pastors are really kind of separated from what it's like to just be a layperson, like what it's like to have a life in corporate America or as a blue collar guy or whatever. They may have had that at one point, but they don't live that life anymore. And so they try to make it up with elders and stuff like that. But then you've got older guys who sometimes it doesn't seem to work either. And then there's issues, and I don't even know how to correct all this stuff. There's issues with just the kind of the roteness of church. You show up, you sing some songs, you don't really participate, you get preached at. Like I want a smaller church where the pastor's asking questions, throwing things out to the audience, and guys are participating and asking, there's some back and forth and some disagreements and, various things like that. I don't know how you do that well, but I know there's just like unthink the model. That was what I would say. Whatever you've been raised on, however it's gone for you, just say, scrap all that. If you were just going to start something day one, you got a tent in a field. How does it roll? Do that, and try to appeal to men and see what happens to your town, see what happens to your city. I think you'll be surprised.
Well, that's great. Well, there's a lot more in it, but I'll stop right there talking about the book and just hold it up again. Tending the Fire by Mike Yarbrough. There's a link to buy it in the show notes if anybody's interested. And as we kind of wrap up the book convo, I got one more comment here I want to throw up there from Thomas. He says, I'm sliding into the crawl space, cutting and replacing a busted cast iron pipe because no plumbers are available. Pretty sure I heard John Williams' Superman 1978 theme as I was coming out.
That's awesome.
Well, congratulations. I have to tell you, my dad could build an entire house by himself. He knows how to do every single task it takes to build a house. Literally, he was construction superintendent on home construction sites. He was a carpenter. He was all these things. I never learned how. He never taught any of that to me, and that was like. And he had his reasons. I'd say somebody said it was especially bad, but I didn't have any skills. A few years ago, I started saying, I'm going to start trying to fix things myself. And I still don't do anything complicated. But, even if it's just a very small task, like, I'm going to put in, I have this closet door. It's only got 2 hinges instead of 3, and the top hinge is pulling out because I got some heavy shoes. I'm going to put a 3rd hinge in there. I'm like, I could do that. I can do little things like that. And every time I do something, every time I come through and and do something like that. There's nothing like the sense of accomplishment you get from kind of doing something like that with your hands.
It is, yeah.
And, Thomas also said his dad came by and dry fitted for me. He was instructing me.
That's awesome.
So he got some coaching. I wouldn't do anything plumbing related like that unless I had
I still hate plumbing, yeah.
So something
stuff. Yeah.
I do have a question.
All right.
This is a legit question. As I said, I still haven't figured it out myself. Wolf and Iron.
Yeah.
You have like a media. Is it a media company or is it a product company? Because you sell beard oils.
Yeah.
And you got some products. One of the things, I'll hold it up. I have this key fob you sent me. It says "Hold Fast" from Hebrews 10:23, I think. Very nice little key fob. You give beard oils. Is that a product company or is that a media? What exactly is it?
So here, it's a good question. So the Wolf and Iron. So we got our other business, Rustic in Maine, where we make wedding rings out of historic woods, and we do some cool stuff like that. That's the primary income for me and my family, and that's the primary business that we own. Wolf and Iron has been, I don't call it a side project, but it's been kind of that sort of side project with sort of this notion of, well, are we selling beard oils right now, or are we building a community, or are we doing whatever? And we've had a kind of a long game approach with this, and I'll just give you some insight. So Wolf and Iron is I think about it as like the spark or the hub of the things that I want to do and grow from. So we've got a podcast. We have, we sell beard oils, we sell T-shirts, different little, things like that. Everything USA made, very cool stuff, very masculine stuff. I see the podcast and also the merchandise as these two avenues to kind of bring guys in. Some guys are just looking for some beard oil. Oh, hey, what's Wolf and Iron all about? Oh, it's about being a better father, better husband, a better man, all around, that kind of stuff. Some guys are just, already searching for that, and they find us through the podcast. Some guys actually are getting married, and so Rustic in Maine captures them, and it's like, hey, we got this other thing called Wolf and Iron, where we talk, just straight up talk about being a man. Oh, cool. And they kind of come over that way. So I kind of see it as this hub. We're developing something called the Foundry right now. It'll be ready, and this will probably, we're almost in August right now, so this will be ready sometime probably in September for everybody else to kind of join. But basically, the Foundry is going to be that community aspect where we're bringing guys in to an actual social media platform that we're curating, we drive, and connecting guys. So getting off of Facebook, getting off of Twitter, and everything else. To try and bring guys into a central place where we have a community of men that are focused on being men. That's always been kind of the plan, but that's come, a little bit later than I wanted it to because I'm busy with other things. So the book, the podcast, the merchandise, all those things, you can think about them as just ways to reach guys where they are, to bring them in so they can start thinking about growing as a man. And then with the eventual goal of launching the Foundry, bringing guys into that, where we further develop, guys into manhood and that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit of everything. And that's one of the things that's kind of cool about it, is that I get to kind of dip my hands into the merchandise side of things, the products. We make the beard oils, everything's made in house, T-shirts and all that kind of cool stuff. And then also do things like this as well.
Well, great. Well, good luck getting the Foundry out there and with your businesses. Again, the book, Tending the Fire, Mike Yarbrough. You can find it on Amazon. You can buy it through Wolf and Iron. Check that out, wolfandiron.com. Visit rusticinmaine.com. Those wedding rings, they're very cool. I mean, they're really good designs. I would just say I don't think that has to be a wedding ring. If you just like the ring and it's very
just
cool.
A ring.
You could get one for yourself and check it out. I thought it was good. So thank you very much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Great conversation, Aaron. I appreciate it.